Hello, fellow mech warriors, Mage Leader here. You know, I love the Mech Warrior franchise. I realize that's not much of a revelation to most of you, but given how often I tear them apart, I'm sure that it could easily be assumed that the opposite is true. Mech Warrior is a deeply flawed series of games that, despite their shortcomings and even at their absolute weakest, still deliver an experience unlike anything else in the gaming landscape. The ability to tinker with nearly every aspect of a massive war machine before riding it into battle is an addictive prospect, and it's the kind of thing that never gets old, no matter how hard Piranha tries. But you didn't come here to listen to me ramble about Mech Warrior, you saw the title. So why am I rambling about a completely different game series? Well, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I have some strong opinions on today's discussion topic, and I might have some things to say that could come across as harsh, overly critical, contrarian, and outright contradictory. Just understand that beneath all the strong language and stronger opinions, I hold a deep-seated love for this series that almost rivals my love of Mech Warrior. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's not waste any more time and just dive right in. Today I'm going to take you on a journey, a little roller coaster ride through my complicated relationship with Armored Core. Armored Core. I love Armored Core. What a wonderful series. Wondrous customization, fathomless build variety, endless possibilities, perfect difficulty, a genuine sense of mastery, satisfying and addicting bite-sized missions, dogshit controls, bullshit mission design, enemies with overpowered loadouts, the fucking overheat mechanic, platforming, trial and error gameplay, man, fuck Armored Core! No other series in existence threatens to drive me to the brink of my sanity quite like this one. I adore it, when everything clicks and I'm slamming these missions down one after another like Captain Haddock in a whiskey closet. It's the most fun I've ever had in gaming. But on the other side of the coin, there's some missions in these games that hold some of the absolute worst game design I've ever seen. And I'm not talking about your typical, oh, this mission took me 2 tries instead of 1, so it sucks kind of design. I'm talking escort missions with suicidal AI, defense missions with dozens of enemies that come from all directions and can kill the target in a single hit. That one mission with the fucking fighter jets defending a blimp, yes, a blimp, on a narrow platform where falling off is instant death. Getting ambushed in a forest and shot by stealth machines that I'm convinced are actually impossible to kill. These games have levels that play out like what you'd make if you were trying to do a parody of bad game design. It pisses me off like nothing else, and I hate how much I love it. Well, except Last Raven, but we'll get there. Needless to say, it's difficult to describe my opinion on the series as a whole, something that isn't helped by the fact that the series has taken several major shifts over the course of its history, some of which I loved, and some of which have left me very disappointed. My plan, then, is to go over each of the major eras in turn, describing my opinions on them as best I can. I haven't played every game in the series, but I have played all the mainline numbered entries and a few spin-offs here and there, so that's what we'll be focusing on here. If your favorite spin-off isn't mentioned, I apologize, but it's probably because I haven't had a chance to play it yet. Perhaps in the future I'll make a second video on those titles specifically, once I've had a chance to go in depth with them. Also, the retro gaming market is a royal clusterfuck where these games are concerned, and emulation can be fairly spotty, so getting these games playable isn't always an easy task. Recording footage for them is even trickier in many cases, so I will be relying on footage from across YouTube in addition to my own gameplay. I've listed all the channels in the description, so go and check them out when you get the chance. Now, let's begin with the game that started it all. Armored Core was released back in 1996 on the PS1, and it's really damn good. In fact, if I were to put all the Armored Core games I've played into a 2007 style top 10 list, this game would be in second place. It's that good. I didn't get a chance to play this one back when it came out, mostly because my parents had just finished raw dogging at the time. In fact, outside of Armored Core 6, it's the one that I played through most recently. How recently, you ask?
Last night.
I'd played the other entries in the series, but the original game had something of a mystique, a reputation for crushing brutality and punishing difficulty, even by the standards of Armored Core. I'd always shied away from it as a result. I assumed it would be too janky, too dated, and too prototypical to be any fun to my modern gamer sensibilities. Physical copies of the game go for ludicrous prices nowadays, and I wasn't willing to screw around trying to get an emulator working for a game I was convinced I wouldn't even like. But one day, I discovered the joys of free McBoot and a modified PlayStation 2. With a $2 memory card and an $8 flash drive, I could put the PS1's library onto my PS2, and while scrolling through totally legal websites and snagging various ISOs, I grabbed Armored Core on a whim, something that would have been a lot more difficult had it not been for today's sponsor, NordVPN. So I sat myself down in front of the TV and braced myself, ready for a rough night in the infamous Armored Core Human Plus death spiral, but to my surprise, that didn't end up happening. Instead, I found myself zipping through the missions at breakneck speed, gradually buying, selling, and building my way into a playstyle. By the time I realized what was going on, hours had passed and I was bashing my head against the final mission. I'd been sucked into the addictive game structure, endlessly customizing every last detail of my machine to better serve my style of play, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself, because I haven't introduced this game properly for those who might not be familiar with it. So, what is Armored Core? As you've probably seen, Armored Core is a mech sim game in a similar style to MechWarrior, but with a decidedly more Japanese anime twist. You play as a mercenary, who in this universe are known as Ravens, and your job is murder. The Armored Core universe is a post-apocalyptic setting, where humans have destroyed the surface world in a massive war known as the Great Destruction, and now live in massive underground cities. The world is run by two massive corporations, both fighting each other for control over various factories and territories. You make money by taking on missions from the corporations, and your money is used to both maintain and upgrade your primary tool, your Armored Core, or AC. It is a very simple game, but one with a shocking amount of depth. Your AC has literally hundreds of possible builds available, and what you choose is mostly down to how you like to play. Depending on what you equip, you could be sailing through the air and gliding around like a rocket-powered ballerina, or stomping your way through the missions as a nigh unstoppable walking tank, or perhaps even a rolling or a gliding one. You have the power to make the game whatever you want it to be, just as long as you can make it work in the field. You're free to experiment and try things out to your heart's content, since you can always sell and buy back your parts at the same price. It sounds like a pretty free-form experience, a virtual toy box. So where does the brutal reputation come from? Well, it probably comes from the game's economy. Your mission payout is a set value, but your take-home pay is not. At the end of each mission, expenses will be deducted, such as the cost of repairing your AC or replenishing your ammunition. The more damage you take, and the more rounds you shoot, the less money you take home. This means that it's possible to complete a mission successfully and still lose money. So yes, you can make whatever kind of AC you want, but that doesn't mean it'll be profitable. So the game becomes a balancing act between throwing on what you think is cool and sticking with what will minimize your financial losses. Fortunately, these aren't mutually exclusives, and typically the builds that work tend to be the builds that are fun. But for a new player, it can feel daunting. There's genuine pressure to perform well, since poor performance can lead to debt, and when you're in debt, you're not allowed to buy anything from the shop. Get far enough in debt and you hit the Human Plus ending, where your character will be forcibly augmented against their will, and your save file will be reset to the beginning. You can play on, but now with a massive buff enabled to make the game easier. That might seem tough, but don't let it intimidate you. Players love to emphasize the punishing nature of the economy and the difficulty as a way of making themselves seem more badass for having beaten the game, but the moment-to-moment gameplay isn't nearly as hardcore as you might be led to believe. Anyone who's watched my live streams knows that I'm not a patient gamer. I'm easily frustrated by difficulty and failure, particularly when retrying the same thing over and over, and I'm woefully deficient in the skills department. If a game is crushingly difficult, I don't tend to enjoy it. If I can fall in love with Armored Core, then it's probably not all that hard. The majority of the challenge comes from getting to grips with Armored Core's archaic control scheme and getting a feel for your AC and how it handles. Being a third-person action game on the PlayStation, it's got a clunky set of controls. This was the Dark Ages before the more enlightened era of dual analog sticks, a concept that FromSoft wouldn't begin to grasp for over a decade, and still hasn't quite mastered even today. As such, you play this game using the D-pad. Forward and backward do what you'd expect, but aiming left and right is handled with the D-pad as well, which can lead to some confusion for those unaccustomed to such schemes. Strafing is done with the left and right shoulder buttons, with the face buttons controlling your weapons and thrusters. The triggers control aiming up and down. It sounds bad,
Which it is.
but again, don't let the cursed images of psychopaths holding their controllers backwards scare you away. It's the default setup for a lot of PS1 games, and while it's not ideal, it's still perfectly playable once you get the hang of it. The other half of the challenge comes from the feel of the ACs, especially early on when you're playing without any mobility upgrades. If your first Armored Core game was any of the ones from the PS3 or later, you might want to sit down for this next bit. ACs are quite heavy, and they don't move very quickly. Boosting helps in a pinch, but until you upgrade your thrusters and generator, you're going to be spending most of your time walking. And yes, boosting on the ground depletes your thrust gauge. The pace of combat is far slower, making this less of a Gundam game and more of a Dougram one. But slow doesn't mean boring. In fact, it's some of the most nail-biting and intense combat out there. Wrestling with your heavy machine, fighting the controls, mastering the feel to position yourself for that perfect cannon shot, it's all solid, heart-pounding stuff. Your enemies in Armored Core are another part of the appeal. In most missions, you are the most powerful thing on the field. The enemy is coming at you in lesser machines called MTs, combat drones or aircraft. They don't have your arsenal or your capabilities, and while they certainly pose a threat, especially in numbers, there's no mistaking that you are the dominant force. It's a power fantasy delivered in quick, bite-sized missions that deliver just the right amount of dopamine, and the way the missions blend with the customization always pushes you to have just one more, like a box of Oreos. Then there's the bosses. Now, FromSoft is known for their epic boss fights today, but in Armored Core they work a little differently. While yes, there is a set piece or two, the true boss encounters are other Armored Cores, machines built in the same parameters as you, a worthy opponent that you will need to best before you can proceed. These guys are the real deal, but they aren't invincible. Just like you, they have a finite amount of ammo, they can only boost for so long, and they're fighting the heavy nature of their machines just as much as you are. It's not a test of memorizing their patterns or dissecting their quirks. It's all about who's got the better build, and who's better at utilizing what they've got. These fights are where Armored Core is at its absolute best. Not some giant helicopter, not a rolling weaponized furnace, not a giant web of missile launchers with a couple arms attached. Just you and another Raven battling one another on equal footing. Of course, it's not all perfect. The original game suffers from a lot of PlayStation woes, mainly in the form of camera issues. It's not uncommon for your own character model to obstruct your view. While you can trust the auto-aim for the most part, trying to actually find and lock a target can get slippery, particularly when fighting airborne targets. Most of your frustrations are likely to result from two things, those being enemies that are above you, and platforming. While most missions in the game play to its strengths, there are several that are an absolute nightmare. Trying to keep things alive in a fight is usually fine, but can result in a few cheap failures. That's typical with most games that have those kinds of levels, but the ones that are unforgivable are the ones that require some kind of precision movement. ACs are built for combat, and your boost is designed to help you avoid incoming fire. Trying to land on a platform no wider than your own leg spread is a recipe for disaster, and the game requires this of you more than once. The final mission in particular is one of the most brutal and outright unfair final levels in all of gaming. The gauntlet you have to run through here requires 2 consecutive boss fights, precision platforming, and swarms of standard enemies all in a single run. There are no checkpoints, there are no resupplies, there are no repair kits. For those who've been diving into AC6, imagine having to do the entire Balteus mission start to finish, artillery, AC fight, and the boss, without getting a single chance to repair your AC or refill your ammo. That's what the final mission of Armored Core is. Perhaps this final stage alone is what gives the game its reputation. It is a slog, and you will fail many times. Beating it is more about luck than anything else. I don't know how long I spent trying to get through it, but it was hours, and even with the help of guides and walkthroughs, I barely scraped by. Fortunately, the game does throw you a bone after beating it with a kind of New Game Plus. You get the ability to replay past missions, including ones you might have missed out on the first time, essentially turning the game into a sandbox for your customization. So that's the original Armored Core. It's not a perfect game. The controls are awkward, the visuals are dated, and the level design is wildly inconsistent, but while this game nearly broke one of my controllers, I can't stay mad at it. That addicting loop of 5-minute snippets of pure adrenaline action followed by 10 of unfiltered dopamine from the customization is the most enjoyment I've had with a game since my first playthrough of Twilight Princess, and that's my favorite video game of all time. If you've never played this old classic, then do yourself a favor. Find a platform to play it on, whichever works best for you, and dive in. And if you're a From Software fan who only cares about Souls-like games, then I implore you to come and see what you've been missing. They may have gotten their start with Kingsfield, but Armored Core was where they started to come into their own. The original game would get 2 spin-offs, those being Project Phantasma and Master of Arena. I haven't had the opportunity to play them yet, but rest assured that as soon as I'm done with this video, they're next on the list. The next big hit for the series, and the next game that I've actually played, came out in 2000. And with that, we transition onto the second era of Armored Core. The PlayStation 2 needs no introduction. This thing was sold more often than your mom's Snatch. It was a monster of a console that took the world by storm, and Armored Core was right there at the forefront, leading the charge. It was a launch title for the system, and damn if that visual upgrade isn't one of the sweetest things I ever saw. This is not a game that I own personally. My family was far too poor to afford a full video game console. I had a Game Boy Advance and a handful of cartridges. No, I played this game at a friend's house because he not only owned a PS2, he was a huge mecha fan. Every main Armored Core game, every weird and clunky robot game the system could offer, he owned it. I wasted several Saturdays on Armored Core 2, but ironically, it's probably the one about which I have the least to say. Armored Core 2 is, and I mean this in the best way possible, the exact same game as Armored Core 1, but with a few refinements. I don't say this to diminish the game. The changes it made seemed small at first, but they drastically impacted the play experience in a positive way. Levels were bigger and more detailed, but still just the right length. The bullshit was toned down significantly, and the missions overall were better designed. It had the same addicting gameplay, the same mesmerizing garage, and though it had the exact same warped control scheme as the first game, things felt a bit smoother around the edges. In essence, Armored Core 2 is every bit as fun as the game that preceded it, but there's one big improvement that it had over the first. Project Phantasma had introduced a nifty little feature, and Armored Core 2 had decided to keep it going. Welcome to the Arena, a place where players pit their ACs against those of other Ravens in an all-out 1v1 duel. It was a glorious addition to the series, and one that's been a staple of it ever since it was first introduced. The Arena isn't just a fun side mode, however. Fighting in these bouts, and even losing them, doesn't cost the player any cash, which makes it the perfect place to test out new builds and grind up a little extra dough. For some people, the Arena mode is seen as the main game, and it's certainly fun enough to carry the experience on its own if that's what you prefer. As you can imagine, the Arena adds a whole new layer of addictive fun onto the already excellent gameplay loop, which makes Armored Core 2 even harder to put down. But other than that, I don't have much to say about it that I haven't already covered with the first game. They're incredibly similar, and even a few of the missions are remixes of older ones. I love Armored Core 2, but it's mostly for the same reasons that I love Armored Core 1. Armored Core 3, however, that's something else entirely. AC3 is one of those special games for me, one of those formative experiences that defines your taste in gaming for years to come. It wasn't my first Armored Core game, but it was the first one that I loved. This was the first time that it all clicked, where I got caught up in the loop, where I pushed myself through the frustration and forced myself to come to grips with the outdated control scheme that the series was still using for some fucking reason. I read every lore entry, played every mission, replayed the campaign as many times as I could, spent literal days perfecting my technique in the Arena. My young mind was sucked in and held prisoner, and I can't remember any game that ever made me feel as happy as AC3. I played this game more than my buddy who actually owned it. I played it so much that when I finally bought my own PS2, he gave it to me as a birthday present. Man, I bought that PS2 at a pawn shop for $40. Guy had a shelf of games for it, $5 each. Same for NES and SNES. Retro gaming used to be so much fun and affordable. But once I owned my own copy of the game, I couldn't be stopped. I drowned myself in Armored Core 3 so much that I didn't even have time to notice that it's, once again, the same game as the two before, but with even further refinements. The garage and the shop were more expansive, the options were vast and meaningful, and the gameplay had been polished to a mirror sheen. For the first time, the combat didn't feel clunky to me. Once I got the hang of the controls, it developed a kind of flow that I just didn't feel in the other games. I had a sense of mastery over it, and while my skills have degraded over the years, after revisiting it over the past few weeks, I was pleased to see that it's still just as fun as it was all those years ago. I'm going to sound like a boomer here, but damn, they just don't make them like they used to. The mission design is better than ever, the garage is perfectly executed, everything is nestled in the Goldilocks zone. My only regret is that they didn't make a portable version for me to take on those long car trips. Oh shit! The game would go on to have spin-off titles, which I never got the chance to play as a kid, and it wasn't for lack of trying. They weren't easy to find in my backwoods area. If it wasn't at the local pawn shop or the Bangor GameStop, then I wasn't going to find it. I did try to look online a few times, but, well. And with that, we come to the next mainline game in the series, the one that I've been waiting to talk about. Oh boy, some feathers might get ruffled here. Let's talk about Armored Core: Last Raven. Last Raven is beloved by many Armored Core fans. There's a large section of the community who consider it to be the best in the series. I am not one of these people. Last Raven, much like the original Armored Core, has a reputation for being hard. And unlike the first game, the reputation is well deserved. Last Raven is home to some of the most controller-shattering bullshit I have ever encountered, not just in the Armored Core series, but in gaming as a whole. You would think, being the first main entry to finally figure out dual analog sticks, that it would be easier. You would be dead wrong. In fact, my headcanon is that they're the reason it's so much harder than before. Difficulty in Armored Core games is a bit of a touchy subject. What one person finds difficult, another person might not have a problem with, and people tend to look down on those who struggle with things that they find easy. Any conversation around it tends to devolve into a dick measuring contest with the immensely unhelpful get good mentality dominating the discourse. Yeah, the FromSoft easy mode discussion predates Elden Ring. Hell, it predates Demon's Souls. But I'm not going to get tangled up in that bullshit. Armored Core, up until Last Raven, was a challenging but largely fair experience. If you had mastered control over your machine and your playstyle, then you could handle pretty much anything the game threw at you. Last Raven doesn't feel that way. The difficulty in Last Raven feels incredibly cheap by comparison, as if the devs are trying to compensate for the easier controls, but don't quite know how. The missions in this game rank as some of the most frustrating in the series. They often come across as outright unfair. Early on, your customization is limited, particularly by the more punishing economy. You can no longer sell and rebuy parts and weapons at the same price. They're now more expensive to buy than to sell, and so experimenting with different builds comes with a fee attached. This one design choice alone throws a wrench into that fun factor that the prior games did so well, and early on it can make things outright painful. For a series veteran who already knows what they want, this isn't as big of an issue. After all, Last Raven came after a long line of very similar titles, so players should already have a good idea of what build to go for without the need for experimentation. But here's the thing. I didn't play Last Raven after those other games. Last Raven was my first Armored Core game. Shh, listen. You hear that? That's the sound of every Armored Core veteran flinching at once. This game was too much for a young mage leader. At the time, my gaming experience was limited to Mario, Pokemon, and a weird F-18 flight simulator on the GBA of all things. So hopping into a game that required you to modify your machine in drastic ways to even stand a chance? Well, let's just say I spent most of that sleepover weekend playing Jak and Daxter instead. For 2 years afterward, I couldn't even look at an Armored Core box without breaking out in a cold sweat. That initial beating still colors my perception of the game even now, and coming back to it after having played other games in the series, I don't think my response was unreasonable. Last Raven isn't hard, it's outright bullshit. In chronological terms, it's the first time that an Armored Core game started to feel different, and what a difference it was. Your build options aren't just limited by the new shop economy, but also by the missions themselves. There are just as many options as before, but far fewer of them are viable. It feels like it's pushing you into a specific style of play, which feels antithetical to Armored Core's appeal. Take note of that, we'll be revisiting this later. Obviously, Last Raven isn't impossible, I did beat it, eventually. But did I have fun beating it? Fuck no. In chasing after pure challenge, FromSoft sacrificed the fun aspects of their games, a nasty habit that continues to haunt them to this day, in my opinion. That delicate balancing act between challenge and freeform enjoyment that Armored Core had so perfectly maintained was upset, and as far as I'm concerned, it's where the series started to drift away from what made it so good to begin with. And that doesn't mean that there isn't fun to be had in Last Raven. If you can get past the initial hurdles and swoop your way into a decent build, it can be very enjoyable. Some of the fights are among the best in the series, but it's so loaded with traps and pitfalls that it feels more like walking through a minefield than playing a game, and its difficulty spikes are the reason I have trust issues. I know a lot of people adore Last Raven, but for me, it's a game that I don't plan on revisiting anytime soon, and in many ways, its departures from the formula serve as a dark portent of things to come. And with that, we've gotten through the PS2 era, at least until I dig into the expansions at a later date. And what an era it was. The absolute best of what Armored Core has to offer was reached in that generation, but that success left a lingering question. When you've reached the peak of the highest mountain, the ultimate height you can reach without leaving the ground altogether, where do you go next? It's not an easy question, and if the PS3 era is any indication, FromSoft didn't have a straight answer. Armored Core 4 would be the next mainline entry in the franchise, releasing in 2006 as a launch title for the PS3, and it was different. AC4 ditches most of the heavier, sluggish movement that typified the earlier entries in favor of a more accessible feel. Navigation is far more snappy and responsive. Boosting is more powerful than before, the lock-on system is more generous, and for the first time, the game comes with a full tutorial right from the word go. This was the beginning of the age of mass appeal in game design, and in many ways the game feels like an attempt at course correction after the punishing nature of Last Raven, a way of opening the experience up to a wider audience. Armored Core 4 is possibly the easiest game in the series, both in terms of controls and mission difficulty. It doles out generous payouts on mission completion, and going into debt almost requires that the player put themselves there on purpose. The player is encouraged to experiment and play around with loadouts to their heart's content, and everything feels like a viable choice. I should love this game. The freedom it provides is possibly the biggest it's ever been, but despite how open everything feels, especially in the wake of Last Raven, I just can't bring myself to love AC4. I like it. I'd go so far as to say that I really like it, but there's just something missing. Sure, I can build pretty much whatever I want and it'll work, but so will more or less any random collection of bits. The overabundance of cash and the relative ease of missions means that I never feel like my skill or clever design is carrying me through. It's fun to blow away scores of MTs, but It's a far more shallow kind of fun than what I was used to. The fast combat feels great, and you look super cool doing it, but it doesn't feel like Armored Core to me. I feel less like a ground pounder in an 80s or 90s mecha anime, and more like a Gundam protagonist, and while that certainly has its own appeal, it's not what I personally love about the series. The ACs look so drastically different, so much lighter, almost flimsy. The blocky, brutalist look is gone in favor of something sleek and high-tech. There are times in this game where I feel more like I'm piloting a walking fighter jet than a giant robot, and the weightlessness often makes me forget what genre I'm even in. While Armored Core 4 is something of a return to normalcy in many ways, I get the sensation that FromSoft may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and from what I've seen, a lot of others felt the same way. Some reviews from the time called the game out for being boring, and that's an allegation that no Armored Core game has any business facing. I like AC4 a lot. It's mindless fun, with the most open-ended customization I've experienced, but without enough meat to sink my beak into, I don't end up feeling like much of a raven. And then there's Armored Core for Answer. I'm not going to go super in-depth on this one, I'll save it for when I cover the spin-offs, but you can't talk about Armored Core's current state of being without paying it lip service, so I'll be brief. Armored Core for Answer isn't an Armored Core game, it's Zone of the Enders from Wish.com.
I don't like it very much.
This game doubled down on Armored Core 4's increased mobility, and the combat moves so fast that I genuinely can't tell what's happening most of the time. Watching gameplay of this abomination gives me actual motion sickness, and I'm the guy who plays DCS World in VR. For Answer marks a turning point in the series, the point at which I feel it completely lost its identity. It became a series that was all about spectacle and cheap thrills, like a mecha-themed roller coaster. I realize that this is another favorite for a lot of people, but man, this just isn't Armored Core to me. It's a fun enough thrill ride, but I have a hard time seeing the mech fantasy through all the fucking motion blur. Also, the game is ugly as sin, fuck you. I'll dive into it in more detail at a later date, but for now, suffice to say that For Answer is not what I wanted from this series at all. It was a disappointment that has only been topped by its successor, Armored Core 5. Oh, Armored Core 5. Why? Just why? I get that 2012 was a great time for online shooters, hell, a co-op mode for Armored Core sounds dope as hell, but do you have to sacrifice the entire game for it? Armored Core 5 is a game that is built more or less exclusively for multiplayer, and without other people and their min-maxed bullshit builds, you basically aren't playing jack shit. This godforsaken mess of a game never had a substantial player base, as on top of already being a fairly niche title, the balancing was completely fucked. I played it for about a month when it was new, then put it on the shelf and never even looked at it again. The servers are all shut down now, so the game can't be played as intended, but I can assure you that you didn't miss much. While the gameplay itself was more restrained and reasonable than For Answer, it was still focused on high-speed Gundam fights with the added bonus of enemies that could teleport. Thanks, internet lag! Armored Core 5 is the black sheep of the franchise, the Ace Combat Assault Horizon, if you will. There's not much to talk about, since the meat of the experience went up in smoke years ago, a fate that was shared by its spin-off Verdict Day. I didn't play Verdict Day. I can't play Verdict Day. I will never play Verdict Day. And with that, we come to the end of the PS3 era. Armored Core was present during this time, but it had about as much of an impact on me as your average Marvel film. I didn't find much to love during this time, and when the series slipped into its long hiatus, I was willing to let it go out to pasture. FromSoft was rolling in cash from the success of the Souls series, and they seemed content to clone that game over and over for the foreseeable future. They'd outgrown their robot phase, and I'd been left behind. It was sad to see, and I've harbored a resentment for the Souls series because of it. I tried to get into it, but I found them to be more tedious than challenging. Once the credits rolled on Dark Souls 3, I came to a more accepting state of mind. From Software wasn't making games for people like me anymore. They had a new fanbase now, and that was okay. I didn't bother with Bloodborne or any of the games after it. I just jailbroke my PS Vita, loaded it with the PSP port of Armored Core 3 and a few other old favorites, and let myself drift around in a little nostalgia bubble, enjoying the series I had come to love as it used to be. It was a comfy existence, hiding from the present, but it was not to last. After years of sequestering myself away from the series, after having finally come to the final stage of mourning over the loss of Armored Core, there came an announcement. Armored Core 6. Well, shit. Armored Core was coming back. Initially, I didn't plan on buying the game. I saw the trailers and they didn't do much to ease my skepticism. It had been a long time since From Software had made an Armored Core game, and far longer since they had made a good one. In the years between, they'd been making an entirely different kind of game. Sure, you can draw some shallow points of comparison between Souls and Core, but from a gameplay perspective, they have very little in common. I was concerned that a lot of the Souls-like design would infect AC6, and when the gameplay showed the same Gundam shit that annoyed me in For Answer, I checked out. But then the game released. People started playing it, reviews started flooding in, and the online community was raving about the customization. I couldn't escape that alluring call of the AC garage. I tried going back to the old games again to quench my appetite, but eventually, I caved in. I bought Armored Core 6, and I began to play. I fully admit that I was skeptical, and that may have tainted my first impressions, but things got off to a rough start, and no, I'm not talking about the helicopter boss. I beat that thing on the second try, and the only reason I needed 2 was because the damn thing kept flying out of bounds the first time. No, what put me off at the start was the shop. After that initial intro sequence, I went to perform a time-honored AC tradition, selling off all the useless starter crap and buying 1 or 2 decent parts for the early missions to get a jump start on my build. There's just one problem. The game wouldn't let me. The old parts wouldn't appear in the sell menu. Turns out you're not supposed to sell your old gear because the economy works differently than before. In Armored Core 6, if you're low on cash, you just replay previous missions and grind for money. On the one hand, I enjoy this change. It's always nice to be able to go back to a mission you enjoyed the first time around, or maybe replay one that gave you grief with a better build in the future. But the ability to grind cash has the potential to break the balancing, since the cost of a part is no longer a barrier. In previous Armored Core games, better gear was more expensive, and so you would have to progress through the campaign or arena to save up for what you wanted. This helped to immerse you in your role as a mercenary, and it fit with the themes of the story. You got swept up in the economy of death, killing often innocent people by the score just to get enough money to snag that laser rifle you wanted so badly. Now though, the payout isn't what drives you to pick up your next assignment. I feel like something of value was lost with this change, and that's before we talk about the gameplay implications. FromSoft has given the player access to more or less unlimited funds, and so now the shop has to be balanced. In order to keep the player from breaking the game, they limit what's available in the shop. You straight up can't make an overpowered build in the opening chapters because the shop doesn't have the parts you need to do so. For perspective, here's the number of right-hand weapons available in the shop at the start of Armored Core 3, and here's what you can buy at the start of Armored Core 6. From Software, particularly in the opening hours, forced you into a limited playstyle for the sake of perfectly curating their intended difficulty curve, something that I find to be deeply troubling in a game series that used to be focused on the player's freedom to play as they chose. The game does open up a lot more as you progress, but the first chapter is heavily restricted, something that becomes frustrating by the chapter's conclusion. When the game released, there was a lot of hubbub online over the boss fight that concludes Chapter 1, Balteus. People were struggling with this fight, and I think the shop is part of the reason why. Beating Balteus isn't difficult from a skill standpoint, his patterns are fairly simple, and it's not too hard to minimize the damage you take, though a good chunk of it is unavoidable. Balteus is a tough fight because you need to be able to outpace his DPS, which requires a specific build. When I got to this fight, I had a laser rifle, a sword, and a couple missile launchers, a loadout that had worked great in all the previous missions, but didn't have the raw damage output to break through the shields. My playstyle wasn't good enough. Someone then suggested that I switch to double shotguns, weapons I would never have used because I've always preferred ranged engagements. In prior games, avoiding hits was the only way to make money, and so ranged builds were my go-to. Armored Core 6 doesn't want you to play that way. I tried the dual shotguns and beat Balteus on the first attempt. Balteus isn't a difficult boss fight. He's a gatekeeper to make sure you're playing the game correctly and that you've built your AC the way FromSoft wants you to. Once you understand the technique and build you need to take him down, the other bosses in the game are fairly easy. Shortly after this fight, I unlocked dual miniguns, and those carried me through nearly all of the subsequent boss encounters, very few of which required more than 2 attempts. The gap between a setup that doesn't work at all and one that makes the game an absolute joke is massive, and it feels like only 1 or 2 combinations are viable for any given encounter. Quite often, the build that works best for the mission itself will struggle against the boss encounter at the end, since it seems like 90% feel the need to end with a boss for some reason, which is probably why they've added checkpoints and the ability to switch out your loadout mid-mission. Some have called this a quality of life improvement. I call it a band-aid for a problem entirely of FromSoft's own making. The boss fights of AC6 are simultaneously the best and worst things about the game, and you can really feel the Dark Souls influence at its strongest in these moments. While some of the bosses are 1v1 AC battles like the best encounters of prior entries, the lion's share are massive set pieces, the kind of boss that would have been the climax of an older title. The fights are fun, even the ones that pushed my shit in, which is a rare balance to achieve. Credit where it's due, but as I dodged a massive glowing sword swing and pressed up on the D-pad to restore my health while keeping an eye on my stagger meter, I once again forgot that I was playing an Armored Core game. If I squinted and blurred my own vision, you could have told me I was playing Sekiro or Jedi Fallen Order, and I would have probably believed you. Armored Core has always been a very diegetic series of games. Everything the game does is part of the setting, from the info on your HUD to the menus themselves. AC6 feels a lot more artificial in comparison, and while it's not bad from a gameplay perspective, I found it much harder to get immersed in the world. The biggest culprit is the aforementioned stagger bar. It's a carryover from other action titles. Its purpose is to encourage the player to adopt an aggressive style, instead of hiding behind the block button like a little bitch. In games like Sekiro and Jedi Fallen Order, it's paired with a parry mechanic in order to make fights feel more like a duel. In Armored Core 6, it's a bar that fills up the more you get hit by heavy or sustained weapons fire. The mechanic's inclusion confuses me. It serves its purpose well enough, I certainly do play aggressive and try not to get hit because of it, but here's the thing. I was already playing like that. Aggressive and highly evasive play was already one of the better strats in prior titles. You avoided hits not because the game would freeze your character in place if you got smacked too hard, but because the more damage you took, the less money you earned. You played aggressively because the best way to maximize hits and avoid wasting expensive ammo was to get up in the enemy's grill. It managed this without having this arbitrary, distinctly video gamey mechanic being shoehorned into their mech sim game. Its inclusion further confuses me because there's very little skill involved with its implementation. There's no timing-based dodge or parry to perform, though with how inconsistent the dodge is, that's probably for the best. Boss fights revolve around this mechanic, becoming less about demonstrating your mastery, and more about having the right weapons to fill the yellow meter over the enemy's head. I don't like dual miniguns as a playstyle, but I stuck with it because it's one of the quickest ways to fill up the stagger bar, especially in the mid-game. And if you're filling that bar quickly enough, then these massive epic fights often end up deflating into a comically short exchange of bullets. Sure, I could handicap myself and avoid that loadout, but I shouldn't have to. And look, overpowered setups are nothing new in Armored Core, but at least you usually had to earn them in some way, either by playing smart and using your limited funds wisely, or by finding them hidden in the levels. You never felt pushed into using them, and they had drawbacks. Yeah, twin chain guns are overpowered in AC3's arena, but taking them into a mission will have your ammo costs swallow your profits. If I played AC3 the way I played most of AC6, spamming 2 miniguns and twin missile racks, I would never have made any money at all. The cost of using a powerful weapon balanced out its effectiveness, but now money is no longer an obstacle. But that's not the biggest disappointment. No, that comes in the form of the actual game structure itself. Armored Core has always had an addictive core loop, as I've said numerous times throughout. The short mission lengths provide just the right amount of dopamine to keep things rolling, and the just one more appeal is super strong. You want to drop into battle again and again, because just another couple minutes could finally get you that set of legs you've been ogling. Then when you get the legs, you want to try them out, so you jump back in and do another one, and another, and another. This is what I love most about Armored Core, and it's completely absent from AC6. Not only are the missions substantially longer, but they're more often than not capped off with some kind of boss encounter. Hopping in and testing out your new kit to snag a quick buck for the next one? That doesn't happen here. I was having more fun replaying past missions than I was progressing the story. None of this is to say that I don't like Armored Core 6. In fact, the exact opposite is true. I think it's overall a very well-designed third-person action game, much like FromSoftware's other titles. The action is frantic and flashy as hell. The combat, apart from the occasional shoddy hitbox and the inconsistent dodge, is really enjoyable. All in all, I had a good time with the game, and I think that for people who've never played an Armored Core game before, or for people who enjoyed the PS3 games, It's an easy recommend. The story is among the best the series has ever had, the visuals are glorious, and some of those boss fights are fucking spectacular. You get a level of control over your AC's appearance that dwarfs anything the prior games offered, and while I feel the customization itself has been hampered by the boss design and an over-reliance on the stagger mechanic, it's still enjoyable to tweak your machine until you get it just right. But if you ask me, this game is an Armored Core. It's the mutated love child of Sekiro and Zone of the Enders. It's a great game, but for this boomer, just isn't the direction I hoped the series would go. And with that, we come to the end of my journey through the Armored Core series. This is a franchise that's near and dear to my heart, despite how often it drives me to the brink of insanity. There is so much to love about it, and so much to despise. I'm sure the fact that the last AC game to truly capture my love came out over 20 years ago says more about me than it does about the games themselves, but even after going back to these old favorites, I genuinely feel that there was something special in those old games that the series has lost somewhere along the way. I'd like to think that it's more than nostalgia blindness. After all, I hadn't played the first game up until just before I started this project, and I absolutely adored it. But do I love it more because it's genuinely better? Or do I love it more because of how much it reminds me of AC3? Honestly, I'm not even sure anymore. I suppose in the end it doesn't really matter. Either way, while I still had fun with the latest game, I'm afraid Armored Core has joined the ever-growing list of franchises that have moved on and left me behind. They don't really make games for people like me anymore, and I guess that's not altogether a bad thing. After all, there's a new game out that other people get to enjoy now. A new generation of Armored Core fans that might never have existed otherwise. I suppose in the end that matters a whole hell of a lot more than having a new game that caters to my antiquated tastes. Still, when people ask me, "Hey, isn't it great that Armored Core is coming back?" I can't help but reply, yeah. Yeah, it sure would be great if it did. If you made it this far into the video, then thanks for listening to my rambling. I've kind of wanted to get this off my chest for a while. My love-hate relationship with Armored Core is something I've never really put full voice to until now, and I hope that my feelings toward the series are at least somewhat comprehensible. I hope no one's too pissed off by my distaste for Last Raven and for Answer, or my disappointment in AC6. These are all good games, and I can genuinely see why others love them. But if you don't mind, I'll just stay here in my comfy little corner with AC3 Portable loaded up on my PS Vita. Now if you'll excuse me, this orphanage isn't going to blow itself up. Gotta make room for a bigger one now that I've made so many new orphans after all. Thanks once again for watching, and as always, this is Mage Leader, signing off.